Hi, I'm Brian Russell. Welcome back to class. I want to talk a little bit about Psalm 77 and especially the shifts that take place in the middle of the psalm. But let me have a personal note of privilege. Psalm 77 is actually the reason that I became so interested and passionate about the Psalms of Lament. You see, I was like many of you in this class. I didn't know anything about the laments, and I had already gone all the way through Asbury Seminary. And I was in my Ph.D. program living in Richmond, Virginia, and this experience would have taken place somewhere probably roughly 1999. And I was feeling a great deal of pressure and turmoil and pain in my life, and really in some real deeply personal ways. And I can remember driving through the streets of Richmond, and I was ready to give up. And I can remember literally yelling at God because I was so upset and felt such a grave injustice was happening to me. And I remember simultaneously feeling massively guilty about those feelings, like, how dare I? What was interesting is after that car ride ended, I got myself back over to my library carrel. As a PhD student, I had a research carrel, and I was working on my dissertation at that time on Exodus 15, and I was tracing out word usages within Exodus 15 elsewhere in the Old Testament. And Psalm 77 has a couple of allusions back to Exodus 15. And so I found myself reading this psalm, and the psalm, especially in the beginning, expressed so deeply how I was feeling. And I felt like at that moment that, wow, the way that I had been praying sounded a lot like the psalmist, and I realized the potency of the Psalm of Lament. Now, anyway, let's go back to Psalm 77. If you would do an IBS survey, and again, this wasn't a required part of the work, you would note that there's a real change that takes place. And one of the main structures in Psalm 77 is what we would call a cruciality, where the psalmist moves down and then it moves towards a climax. And the pivot, in my estimation, takes place here in verses 10 to 15. So basically from verses 1 to 9, and these would be the verses, the way that I'm calculating these these are the English verses here. The Hebrew goes a little bit differently. And so when you look at these verses, we have the psalmist's plight and essentially the psalmist openly questioning God. And then we have this dramatic shift that then leads to the psalmist essentially praising God for his mighty acts in the Exodus and in the wilderness. And notice how in the climactic lines, the psalmist, after reflecting on the Exodus and the passage through the sea, reminds God's people that God led his people through Moses and Aaron. And in case you didn't study this really carefully, in a sense, the psalmist's ultimate solution is to reinvest in the traditions of the Exodus and wilderness, and remember what Moses and Aaron ultimately represent in the Old Testament. This would be the Torah. And what does Aaron represent? It represents the priesthood, which is the temple. And so we have essentially word and worship as the grounding forces that can help us in those times of deep trouble. Now, let's go back and look at some of the shifts that take place here when we talk about a cruciality. Now, what you want to note, or how does the psalm change? Well, notice when the psalmist reflects on who God is, like verse 10, and we're going to talk about verse 10 in particular here in a minute because a lot of things turn on this, and also you'll see that in the grammatical analysis that I'm going to include as a second video in this series here. But we have this whole question, something like, it's my grief that the right hand of the Most High has changed. I'll call to mind the deeds of the Lord. I will remember your wonders of old. I will meditate on all your work and muse on your mighty deeds. So essentially, right in the middle here, the first couple of verses, really 10 to 12, notice, and this picks up some of the stuff from verses 1 to 9, notice that the psalmist, it's I language. I. The psalmist is isolated. The psalmist is undergoing God talk. The psalmist asks questions about God as though God's an object. He's like verses 7, 8, and 9, he asks questions. Will the Lord spurn forever? Well, for goodness sakes, this is supposed to be a prayer, and the psalmist is talking about God rather than talking to God. That's what God talk is. It's when we make God an object rather than the subject. By the way, one of the dangers of seminary is we engage in a lot of God talk, talking about God, and we oftentimes neglect the necessity of speaking with God and allowing God to speak to us through word, through worship, through our solitude practices. We have the focus on lament. God, where are you? Why is this happening? And then we have the chaos then that reigns. Again, one of the pieces of being a religious person is religion can make bad times worse because we expect God to act in certain ways, and when we find ourselves essentially neck deep in trouble and God doesn't seem to be around, that creates existential crises for us in our faith that are exacerbated precisely when we engage in these things. The I talk, isolated, God talk. The lament's ultimately helpful, and even experiencing the chaos can open us up in some ways to God. But notice what happens in the shifts here. And you can see the shift in the language itself. Look at verse 13 in English. Suddenly the psalmist begins addressing God. It's you. It moves from I to you. We also see the psalm here moves from isolation as a person to we have community. Look at the language in verses 14 and 15. You are the God who works wonders. You have displayed your might among the peoples. With your strong arm, you redeemed your people, which would also be the psalmist's people, and the descendants of Jacob and Joseph. And so we see a community aspect. The psalmist remembers that they're part of a bigger community. We also move from God talk to being God-centered. And what we see here, this is the focus on sacred memory as the psalmist remembers, again, Exodus, wilderness, and those powerful actions that originally grounded the community, and the psalmist begins to experience something of God's presence in that moment. So it moves from lament to worship and praise. And I don't want to draw this as these are somehow a dichotomy, because in most laments we're going to have worship and praise. But notice that this isn't a lack of faith, right? This is the lament leads to praise. And then essentially the chaos in the moment moves to security as the psalmist experiences the transcendence of God, his big actions in the past, and the fact that God is eternal. Now, let me say a couple of things about verse 10, and I'll say more when we do the actual the grammatical analysis work. But Psalm 10 seems to sum up the psalmist's thoughts, and a lot of this turns on how we deal with one of the words in verse 10. And again, this would be verse 11 in Hebrew, and it looks like this. It's a sheen, a noon, olam, vav, tav. And this word, it's a feminine plural, it can be a couple of different things, and it turns on whether this is a noun or this is a verb. Okay, if it's a verb or if it's a noun, we recognize this as a feminine plural ending, and the word shana as a noun means year, so these would be the years, right? And so you have some translations that will translate this something as years. Now, this can also be an infinitive, and this would be the infinitive construct in the Arnold Choi book, of the verb shana, which means change, right? And if you look at this verse carefully, you may have observed that different translations do have different ideas about how to translate it. It all turns on whether this is a noun or a verb. So, for example, the NIV, the King James, the New King James add the phrase "I will remember," something like the days of the right hand of the Most High. And so they have to supply a words to get the meaning. Other translations, this would be the NLT, the NRSV, the RSV, the New Jerusalem Bible, go with taking this as an infinitive construct and translate it something like I have, this is my grief, the right hand of the Lord has changed. Now, that's my sense of how we would want to take this. Again, this isn't an unassailable position. Really smart people disagree on how this, and you can see that from the translations. But if you were trying to figure out how do you get these this wide variety of translations, in this case, it comes down to, is this a infinitive construct of a verb, or is this a feminine plural of a noun that comes from the same root? And so, to me, the evidence that it's about that the psalmist is afraid that God's has changed comes from the way that the psalmist prays here, in particularly verses 7 to 9, where he openly questions the attributes that God had revealed in places such as Exodus 34, 6 and 7. And the questions of being, has God really changed? Is the God that we knew from the past not the same as the God that we knew in the present? And that is what this actually answers as we have this profound revelation of the Exodus wilderness. You have this worship that comes in, and then it ends with this interesting piece about Moses and Aaron. Now, let me say one more thing quickly. And again, we could say a lot more about Psalm 77, but we just wanted to grab this one aspect, and I had you look at this. Now, make sure in your work that you crafted a 2 to 3 sentence theological synthesis. This is going to be a critical dimension. We're going to work on it again in the next module, and this is going to be central. It's going to be worth 25% of the 2 module 7 papers and the module 8 paper. So make sure you're writing your theological synthesis, which is, in other words, what is your take on this? You want to be not just be descriptive, so you want to just say the psalmist shifts. You would actually want to give the meaning of that and not just be descriptive of the content, but you would want to be theologically interpretive, and so be substantive, interpretive, and succinct. Again, 2 to 3 sentences as a summary, and then I was also looking for just a couple paragraphs that would be discussing this. This is to help you prepare to write those next papers. Now, let me say one final thing, which is kind of cool about Psalm 77. Look at towards the very end. Verse 19, your way was through the sea, your path through the mighty waters. So there we clearly have the psalmist remembering the Exodus. But listen to this. Yet your footprints were unseen. Isn't it interesting? Because we always think, geez, if I could have just been at the Exodus, I'd have a rock solid faith no matter what. And here's the psalmist thinking, geez, even if you were there when the sea split and you're walking through there, it wasn't like God put up a sign, hey, God did this. I mean, you could see Moses with his hands, and I think that's why it reminds us of the incarnated presence of God through these things. But it wasn't obvious, right? The footprints were unseen. You might want to ponder that a little bit. Again, I'm Brian Russell. It's my privilege to serve as your professor. I hope this video inspires you and maybe even makes you a little bit hungry to dig a little deeper, raise whatever questions have arisen from my words, or push back on some areas that you'd like some more content on. I'll see you in the forums.